Him's House, episode 18. I'm Jonathan Stern. I'm here with Lewis Stevens and Dr. H. As always, we are also here with Bayside. We had Bayside a couple episodes ago. It was, according to many people, our best episode yet. And so we'd like to have him back to discuss politics. Now, Trump's inauguration is officially 1 week out. And so we want to look at how the upcoming administration and the political environment may impact HIMSS. Let's start with what has been probably the hottest topic among HIMSS investors for the last few weeks. I want to toss it to Bayside for this. You've been giving us odds all along the way. You've been very good about updating your odds regarding semaglutide being taken off shortage. Now, how are you looking at this in light of the news we received regarding tirzepatide, and then looking ahead to the Trump administration as well? How should HIMSS investors be thinking about the semaglutide shortage situation?
Sure. So just to rehash slightly, when the decision was made on tirzepatide, which I believe was December 19th, up until, a few days before that, I'd put out an analysis which got some attention in the Discord and elsewhere, saying that there was a high chance that tirzepatide would come off shortage, which did in fact happen. At the time, I said it was 80% tirzepatide would come off, and I was more guarded about semaglutide. I said 50%. In the immediate aftermath of that, when we did one of our podcasts, I raised the prediction on semaglutide. Frankly, I have to go back and listen. It was either 70-30 or 80-20, but whatever the number was, I raised it up in the immediate aftermath. And that was basically because the tirzepatide percentage, when I said 80-20, I said it looks like a lock to me, but we have to have a little humility. There's always the chance that there's something out there we're not seeing, right? And so go ahead.
And just to interject, the 80 was the percentage that semaglutide would be taken off shortage before Trump assumed office. Is that
correct?
Right?
That was my initial read. Thank you. If it was, I don't remember if I said 80-20 or 70-30, but regardless, I raised it up from the initial 50-50 simply because the FDA had shown its cards. I strongly suspected that they wanted to get both of them off of shortage because of some of the problems that were out there, not associated with HIMSS, but with some bad actors that are out there, that they were strongly motivated to get both drugs off of shortage. Now we had some certainty around that when they made a decision on tirzepatide. And so that raised initially my rating on semaglutide as well. But then the days passed. I in fact thought there was a pretty good chance that we would see a decision the very next day on semaglutide. That would not have shocked me one bit. And if not that following day, which was a Friday, then the following Monday leading into the holidays. Politically speaking, it's not a popular decision necessarily for a lot of users out there. This is the kind of decision that they would consider burying around the holidays because a lot of the people who are normally reporters are off spending time with their families, and it wouldn't get as much bad press. So it wouldn't have shocked me one bit if it had happened during that time period or even during the holidays itself. I think some folks had said, well, they're going home for the holidays, and a lot of the staff are. But nevertheless, the FDA was rolling out decisions between Christmas and New Year's, so it could have happened. And then the immediate aftermath of January 1st, now we're talking January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, in the beginning of the following weeks, still no decision. At that point, we have to start thinking, okay, despite the earlier predictions, which suggested that the FDA wanted to do it, the evidence was not showing that they were actually doing it. And there was always the big counterpoint. While it was obvious the FDA probably wanted both of these drugs to be off shortage, they were limited by lawsuits and the fact that existing doctrine that since earlier last year from the Supreme Court suggested that there was no longer going to be deference to the judgment of agencies, that the courts were going to look at the actual interpretation of what the law said. And I think that's one of the reasons why the decision on tirzepatide was delayed. It doesn't look like it was there. It doesn't seem like the data was there. So every day since then, I've been lowering that percentage. I'd said, and these are judgment calls, but I said 2080 by the end of beginning of this week. So today, Monday, the 13th, would be 2080. and then just slowly ramp down from there. That's probably an oversimplification. If you were to actually think about it in strategic terms, what are the real chances that the FDA would wait until the week before? If you thought it was going to happen, what they would say was, let's give it as much time as possible so we have the best data possible, and we'll pull the trigger at the last minute. That's probably a little bit higher than, say, if it could be Friday, in which case, I'm, at least according to my projection, it's like a 4 or 5% chance it could happen in the last day. It's probably going to be higher than that on that last day, maybe 10. But still, at this point, you have to say, why haven't they pulled the trigger on this yet? They haven't done it. At the very least, you got to say the data is questionable, and most likely it's not there. So that's kind of where we stand currently on that projection.
Okay, and so we're headed down to 0%, or at least if the trend holds, we'll be at 0% in a week.
Right.
Which means semaglutide will still be on shortage on January 20th when Trump is inaugurated. If that comes to pass, Bayside, and Dr. H. Lewis, feel free to jump in as well. How should we be thinking about HIM's status for selling semaglutide through the first half of the year? Now, I should say, and I'm sure you would say this as well, once the shortage is lifted, HIM's would have, I think, 90 days. The FDA just updated from 60 to 90 days post-shortage lifted to continue selling semaglutide. After that, they would have to wind down. But independent of all that, how long would we expect the shortage itself to last?
Yeah, excellent question, obviously. There's a few different factors here. So first, let's talk the political side of it, which I know we're going to spend a lot of time digging into different pieces of the political side, so I won't go into a lot of detail there. But you're going to have a new HHS secretary, most likely RFK. We'll talk about the chances of that happening. Over the past few days, I just happened to post on the Discord. I said, I can't predict with any certainty when that nomination confirmation vote will happen. It looks like the reporting is that RFK probably will get through. If he does, what we can do is look at what was the normal date that an HHS secretary would actually get approved by the Senate if you would look back over the last 6 presidencies. And typically it ranged from pretty early, like right after the inauguration of the president, within the first week or two. But at the late end, I think we were talking April. I think that was Kathleen Sebelius under Obama. So that's your window, late January to April. The middle of the pack seemed to be early March. And so probably we wouldn't see an HHS secretary until around then. Then you have to guess about whether or not RFK, where is it going to be on his list of things to care about? Is he going to do it something like that, right away? Now, I spent time talking about RFK. I should also say that come Monday, next Monday, a week from today, when Trump has been inaugurated, there will be an acting FDA commissioner. That person typically is a career staffer. My judgment, and I could be wrong, but I don't think so, is that a career staffer is unlikely to make a decision that the political staff were not willing to make just days prior. So most likely a career staffer will say, we will wait until we get a new HHS secretary. At the meantime, we will continue to collect data, and as soon as we get to the point where we think the shortage is no longer ongoing, we will run that up the chain and get a political sign off from someone higher up. It could be RFK or somebody else. Potentially it could be McCary. We'll see. I don't think McCary himself will be confirmed quite that early. Usually it's a little bit later, like May or later in the year. But RFK could easily do it if we don't have someone in between that's been put in place. And I should say, I know we talked about this earlier. There is one other thing, which is around what is it that HIMS can do. There's been some confusion around that in a post-shortage situation. I'll let you decide when you want to chat about that.
Yeah, I want to chat about that shortly, but just to nail it down, when would RFK be likely to assume the position, and then Marty Makary, the incoming FDA head?
Yes. So if we go in history, RFK would come in anytime between late January and April.
Okay.
Most likely, it's not going to be right away, and so I would say my guess it'll probably be middle of that range, so like early March.
Okay, and should we see the period in between the inauguration and when those two are appointed, or when they assume their position? Should we see that period, that interlude, as an extremely unlikely time for the FDA to act on semaglutide?
I think so. That's
Okay.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. Acting federal officials who are career staffers absolutely take seriously that it's a temporary position. It's their job to be a custodian and not really, do a whole lot of stuff that political people were not willing to do.
So given all of that, it seems like from everything you've said, the 20% that semaglutide is taken off this week or lower, the probability, the unlikely probability that the career staffer takes it off shortage, that we would have semaglutide on shortage in all likelihood through March, maybe April, which means that HIMSS could sell semaglutide fully through the first half of the year.
Yeah, if you add on those 60 and 90 days, it looks that way.
If you add on the 90 days, right?
Yeah.
In which case, and I don't mean to paint a bullish picture here. I mean, this is temporary revenue, no matter how you slice it. But the city report that came out last week did suggest that I think they lowered their GLP-1 estimates for full year 2025 from 400 million to 125 million. So, like, assuming, a third of what they originally assumed, which, if semaglutide stays on shortage, is probably undershooting it by a decent amount.
Yeah, I think so too. I know we haven't even gotten to the point about personalized compounding, which is apparently a real issue.
Yeah, so let's go there now. Okay.
I feel like we're at a perfect point for me to. We'll see how this quote goes. But my question to you, Bayside, is, you've done such phenomenal analysis. We've worked through this last 60, 90 days, as the HIMSS House community of identifying when these drugs would come off shortage. And, you've done a great job. So now I don't know how strong your perspective is on this, but I'm just going to ask the question. So let's just assume that semaglutide's already off shortage. On the Q2 2024 earnings call, Andrew Dudum articulated his logic for the belief that they will continue to sell GLP-1s with or without the shortage. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to try to read this quote and see. I think it'll be quick, and then maybe that'll set you up well, Bayside, to answer the question I have here. So on Q2 2024 earnings call, analyst Jack Wallace asks, just wanted to follow up on the last question, maybe ask the personalization element in a different way. Is there an existing product in the market or existing form factor that is personalized enough, or is it through a personalized dosing regimen, personalized enough to operate under a personalization exemption after the drugs are off shortage? Or do they need to be further, does there need to be further personalization enhancements? And Andrew Dudum responded, the short answer is that compounded exemption. It's relatively clear, and there's been decades of established precedent with regard to what qualifies as personalized. And this is often a form factor, as you outlined, or it could be dosing dynamics if a patient is not getting the outcome they're hoping for, or they're experiencing side effects that are intolerable. And then I won't read the rest of the quote, but in essence, I'm sharing this quote so that everybody else can go read the transcript from Q2 2024 and make their own decisions. But in essence, he was saying that personalization, there's established precedent for personalization, enabling HIMSS to sell GLP-1s with or without the shortage. Bayside, do you have a strong perspective on this? Do you believe Andrew Dudum? Do you think it's like a fractional thing where maybe unfettered selling of GLP-1s results in 500, whereas exclusively personalized selling results in 150 million for 2025 in revenue, 500 million is what I meant there. Do you have a take on all of this in a post-shortage world?
I do. I should say, and I'll give Dr. H a warning because I'm going to ask him a question in a minute or two, is because he's our qualified physician here. and I am not. By the way, just as a background, if anyone, because I'm obviously I'm off camera, that's for professional reasons. I run a nonprofit organization in Washington D.C. that does policy related work, and whatever my opinions on stocks are probably not something my employer wants to be associated with, but there's no other reason. But for folks to be able to judge,
I believe I forgot to give you that hearty introduction.
That's okay.
That's terrible.
Because people want to know, like, am I just spouting off and do I know anything? My background is full-time professional lobbyist at the national level, although the areas of policy that I work in are related to foster children, but there are substantial health related and social services issues. So that's a combination of Medicaid, SAMHSA, and then on the human services side, the Administration for Children and Families. I do not work directly on FDA issues. The closest I would have come would be controlled substances, which are typically you'll get treatment options funded through SAMHSA instead. But I know my way around the law and I know the politics side of it. And that's what informs the opinions that you're hearing. So weigh that accordingly. Now, coming back to your question, Lois, I have to confess, the first time I heard that and read that exact same statement that Andrew was making, I thought, this is nuts. I mean, really? He can keep on compounding things even after the shortage gets done. I mean, if that were true, why don't we see more of that all the time? Why don't compounders just willy-nilly compound everything? It seemed to make no sense. I thought it was crazy. The fact of the matter is, I did my homework and I looked into it, and it does appear that Andrew Dudum is correct, but with some caveats, some limitations, which I'll get into in a second. I should also say, from an strictly entertaining point of view, those of us who pay attention to the Discord are also paying attention to Twitter. And so there are some leading luminaries out there. Octi Diplomatin, who weighed in. I think he gave a little bit of a smackdown to another one of our friends, Antonio Linares, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, because he had posted something which was more or less a flow chart, which seemed to show that, in fact, HIMSS could do exactly what Andrew was saying. And Octi, just as I was, I mean, he kind of discounted it. He wasn't buying into it. And frankly, neither was I at first. And then there was another one, Paul Ciro, out there who I think weighed in similar. So I think it's one of these sort of public Twitter spats. And I was originally kind of skeptical. I shared it. But when you look into the law, you find out that, in fact, the law seems to support Andrew's point of view. There is existing law that says basically, as long as it's personalized and there has to be medical necessity, and that's why I'm going to turn to Dr. H in a second. There has to be a medically necessary reason in the judgment of the medical professional who says, yes, there is a medical need for a compounded personalized solution. And that can be any kind of number of things. It could be something like you have an allergy, or it could be you're an old person, you can't swallow pills, you need something in liquid form. There needs to be some medical reason that in the judgment of the doctor, it's needed. But there are all sorts of things associated with GLP-1s, including, for instance, vomiting, nausea. I don't know, not sure if muscle loss would count, but it seems like the FDA has been very clear that they defer to medical judgment on that. The other question that Octi and others raised was, well, it's very clear in the guidance that you cannot compound inordinate amounts of these drugs without it necessarily directly being defined or on a regular basis. But if you carefully read the law, that doesn't apply to the situation we just described, where a doctor has said there's a medical need. And then further, the law separately, in a separate part of the law, defines what inordinate means and how it will be defined. And then basically what happens is, under a slightly, just a little bit different part of the law, but close to it, they say the FDA will work with the states and come up with memoranda of understanding, which will define what inordinate is. And in the absence of an MOU, it says that inordinate means anything beyond 5% of all prescriptions by the doctor and or pharmacy. So it has to be 5% or less of all of their prescriptions. But even then, that limit, which, for HIMSS, you have 2 million customers, it implies you could do 5% of that, which is 100,000, which is more than all of HIMSS GLP prescriptions, to my knowledge. I calculated somewhere around 50,000 as of, the last earnings date. Now, there's still a medical need requirement. But even that 5% requirement turns out that in the years since, FDA has been negotiating with the state. They've been consistently sued by compounders, and they've been retreating from that pot. They've been essentially using that as a way to negotiate with states to get them to do more regulation at the state level. And so they've been raising up even that 5% limit. At the last time, and this is still undergoing review, it was up to 50% is the number that they are floating out there on unapproved MOUs, which still need to be finalized on a regulatory basis. So, and at this point, there's no limit. Now, again, despite not having a numerical limit tied to what inordinate means, there still needs to be a medical need. There still needs to be a doctor saying that there is a medical reason to do this. Now, these doctors are part of a network, just like Dr. H was, where, they're supposedly independent, but not really. It does suggest there is a potential conflict of interest if HIMSS is working with a network that is so closely tied to it. Is there some independence? But even that argument is undermined by the fact that a lot of these decisions are made by doctors who are not actually writing prescriptions externally to pharmacies. Doctors themselves, in some cases, are doing the compounding, and there's an explicit conflict there, and it's apparently okay under the current law. So all of which is to say, what Andrew was saying does seem to hold up, and my best guess, take it for what it's worth, and that's why I'm going to kick it over to Dr. H, because I want to hear what he has to say. About a month or two ago, HIMSS put out a report, and you guys put it up somewhere, I think, in the documents segment. It was basically, here's how all of HIMSS weight loss customers are doing. And there's a couple of key data points that they had cited in there. First, there was a Blue Cross Blue Shield study that showed that roughly 50% of GLP-1 users suffer adverse side effects. That's a pretty high number. And then with respect to their own customers, as of the date that report was put out, I believe it was something like 13%. It was a little bit higher. It was like 30, I think maybe 20 or 30%. I don't remember off the top of my head. Were of HIMSS customers were unhappy due to side effects. And basically, if you multiply the numbers together, it turned out to be somewhere in the range of 13% of HIMSS customers were both unhappy and reporting very severe side effects. And that's sort of the low end, because there may be higher percentages, that you can go up from there, especially if you start looking at things like muscle loss and things of that nature. So somewhere in that window between 13% at the low end and 50% at the high end might be the percentage of current GLP-1 customers that may be able to continue under an appropriate medical determination that there is a need. Now, with that said, I would much rather defer to Dr. H, who is an actual doctor, and let's hear what he has to say.
Oh, yeah, that was a lot. And
It's a tough answer to follow.
I did want to talk really briefly about the supposed independent nature of physicians who are practicing medicine online. That's been some of the criticisms against, physicians and who are doing this. Some of the critiques are, are they truly unbiased in their medical care if they're getting kickbacks and things like that? There's something called the corporate practice of medicine in Bayside. You're aware, you obviously know all this stuff. Yeah. Which basically says if you own a company that sells medical medicine products and things like that, the physicians themselves have to be independent in nature. So in the situation with HIMSS doesn't actually employ physicians. They have to, by law, use a professional corporation, third party, have an agreement with them saying, we want unbiased medical care from your physicians. So the third party professional group will have contractors and physicians and things like that who will then serve HIMSS's consultations. So in having experience as working on the HIMSS platform myself in the past, HIMSS has never encouraged a physician to prescribe a medicine. In any case where there's ever been a time when the provider physician did not think it was appropriate for a patient to take a medicine, there was never a time when HIMSS said, hey, you should have prescribed this medicine to this person. So the physicians themselves are acting as if the HIMSS patient is their own patient. So it's the physician's medical license that they're using on the line. It's their own risk of taking on this patient as their patient. So in reality, every HIMSS patient that goes through and is seen by the physician, they are treating them as if they were seeing them in clinic. Like, hey, is this person ready to take a GLP-1? If I give them this medicine and they don't actually have a good reason to it and something bad happens, it's my rear end on the line. I'm the one who's going to be subject to malpractice or lawsuits and things like that. So that is the kind of neutrality that's in place that can help these situations with online pharmacies and telemedicine companies, is that there's no extra incentive. HIMSS doesn't pay the physicians more money if they're prescribed more medicines. The physicians themselves get paid the same amount whether they create a prescription or deny a prescription. So that's just an outline of the safeguards in place that help prevent this perception that physicians can be biased and give medicines unnecessarily. In terms of medical necessity, it's quite a common thing in the medical world to create documents of medical necessity. We see this all the time when we're working with health insurance companies and we're trying to prescribe medicines and it gets denied. So in a typical setting, the medical clinic will get a fax or email from the pharmacy saying, hey, this person's health insurance denied this claim or this prescription for X medicine because it's not in the formulary. They prefer this alternative medicine. But you can submit a prior authorization or an appeal. In that process, what you do is you would basically create and draft a document of medical necessity, outlining the reasons why you think this person absolutely needs this medicine. And you would go through kind of chronologically in time. What did the patient experience with the other medicines? Did they try medicines A, B, and C? What were their reactions? When did they do it? Have they actually tried this medicine before that you want to prescribe that is now denied? And you can even write down and say, yes, this person did great on this medicine I want to prescribe, and they did horribly on the first 3 medicines. And then you submit that documentation to the pharmacy again, or the appeals department at the health insurance company. And it does carry a lot of weight. They have physicians on staff at the health insurance company who review this, so they know the medical background of what you're presenting to them, so they can see, yeah, that's right. Medicine A does have that side effect, and if the patient reported that side effect, that's not unusual, and they try these other 2 medicines. And yep, those other side effects are common for those medicines too. So yeah, it does make sense to prescribe this medicine D that we initially denied. So in the world of health insurance, those medical necessity documents are common. And in the situation with HIMSS, I would see it would be relatively easy to gather the information if Andrew Dudum wants to go on that stipulation to allow them to continue doing the compounded medicines. I mean, he was very direct in what he said. It was one of the first things he said in his quote, saying basically we can get by with maybe dosage alterations and things like that. I think that's the easiest way they can probably get around it, is built into the intake with the patient. They could have a very clear questionnaire saying, please list all your medicines you've tried before, and if the person says Ozempic, I could see them following up and saying, what was your dosage of Ozempic? Was it, 2 milligrams or whatever? And the patient would say, yep, 2 milligrams. And, the next question could be, what was your experience like? And the patient could say, it was great, or, I had side effects. If they say it was great, maybe they may not qualify for the compounded medicine. But if they say something like, it was okay, it kind of worked, but had these side effects, maybe I need a different dosage, then that is a situation where the physician could then maybe prescribe a custom dosage like 1.5 milligrams instead of 2 milligrams. And then they could easily pretty much automatically draft up this letter of medical necessity just to have documentation to say, 1.5 is probably better than 2 milligrams. There's less side effect potential than 2 milligrams, but you still get the positive results rather than going too low at 1 milligram, which is available for Ozempic. So it was kind of interesting to see how direct Andrew was in listing that specific dosage exception. I think that's probably the easiest way that they can get around this.
Interesting. I'll just throw it back to you guys. But on the corporate practice of medicine thing, there's been at least one short report over the last year or two that I remember went after Hims on that. It's a really common thing. Hims is not sitting out there like just a sitting duck on that issue. There's all kinds of organizations that probably blur that line on the corporate practice of medicine. I mean, if a doctor's working for a hospital, does that count? And as a result, it's not a hard and fast rule. I have not seen anything that suggests that Hims is at all vulnerable on that. So that's the only thing I would say on that.
I just have to ask, as someone who mostly respects the patent system as the mother of healthcare innovation, recognizes that there are a few drawbacks here and that it doesn't work perfectly, but that without it, we very well might not have companies like Lilly and Novo inventing drugs like GLP-1s. I have to imagine they are going to fight rulings tooth and nail if Hims is able to continue compounding the drugs that they poured billions of dollars into development for. Is there anything related to the Chevron doctrine being overturned that allows us to predict how the courts will rule if Lilly and Novo challenge Hims on further compounding? Maybe I'm misusing the Chevron doctrine.
No, I don't think you are.
It might be helpful to start with an overview of the doctrine. But
Well,
this is just to ask, how are
Well-
Lilly and Novo going to respond to all of this?
Well, it's just so the Chevron doctrine is simply an assumption that used to exist until the Supreme Court overturned it under Loper-Bright, which is a different Supreme Court case, which said, at least originally, the courts were biased towards deferring to the judgment of the agency. And under Loper-Bright, which overturned Chevron, it basically said that no, the courts cannot just ignore that. They have to actually review the law and make their own independent judgment about whether the agency is actually following the law. When it comes to lawsuits, yeah, almost certainly Lilly and Novo will sue everybody, right? They'll sue FDA, they'll sue Hims. When Hims gets sued for the first time, any kind of really major way, it would shock me if they haven't actually already been sued on something, but we're not hearing about it. But if they get some major lawsuit, probably that day that the stock will just drop, right? Because, oh my gosh, they're getting sued as if it's the end of the world. And then before you know it, the next day it'll bounce back because people will quickly realize that lawsuits are just a common occurrence, right? And in some ways, it's a negotiating tactic. Is it impossible that Andrew Doom says all this stuff and they end up doing personalized compounding for something in the range of, say, 20% of their current customers because they rise and meet the medical need standards that Dr. H was just talking about. I'm just throwing that number out there, but let's imagine that's true. And, there's some lawsuit, which is probably, frankly, I don't think that the pharmaceutical companies will win. And then at the end of the day, they end up settling. And as part of that settlement, Hims get some kind of special deal, access to the actual drug from the company. Could that scenario play out? Absolutely, it could. But in terms, I get the point that you're making. Does it make sense that, in a system where pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money doing the research necessary to get these drugs, and we don't want to undermine that incentives system, that argument, which suggests you don't want to let people willy-nilly compound, well, is 15 to 20%. Is that, that's not everything, right? And then the history politically, the reason why these things exist is, compounding is really a very long-standing practice that has existed, I think, as long as, if not longer than, the FDA itself. So while there has been some antagonism between the FDA and compounders, and probably rightfully so, because there's been some shady practices out there, at the end of the day, it's going to be a political battle, and I think they'll find a way to settle it, is my guess. I should also say, by the way, lest any Himsters are out there going, oh my goodness, we're off the hook. Hims can run around and compound anything they want. first of all, I personally want to go check with some other people who know more than I do, who are lawyers and/or people at the compounding world, and see what they have to say. So don't go get crazy and run around and invest all of your money into HIMSS based upon what Bayside said, right? Don't do that. But at the same time, most likely we're talking about a small percentage of what HIMSS is currently compounding that will actually meet these standards. There'll be other things like the oral meds that will be out there. At the end of the day, my big picture is post semaglutide. Probably the key way a HIMSS investor should look at it is, I think revenue will almost certainly go down because they can no longer compound GLP-1s across the board the way they could. But then the question is, what will happen to earnings? Because the oral meds are cheaper, so revenue would be lower. But I think the margins are such that in terms of its impact on earnings, I don't think it's as dramatic a drop as people suggest. And we're in the world where HIMSS is a profitable company now, and the earnings are expected to go up. And the future value of this company will be tied to earnings. I mean, revenue will matter, but it's earnings at the end of the day that will determine the stock price. I don't think it'll have as big an impact as people think.
I'm still on the belief that GLPs are just, on the whole, pretty inaccessible by most Americans. Even if you have insurance, very limited percentage of people have good enough insurance to make branded GLPs actually affordable. $20, $50 copay. Many people are still going to be faced after a shortage. Even if they have insurance, the cost of that medicine might be $600 or more. Yeah. And in that situation, I think most Americans probably will just say, F it, I'm not taking this medicine. I'll just wait until later when it's more affordable and alternative means. Or they might just say, you know what, I had a taste of how great it feels to be losing weight, and I feel better. My energy was better when I was at a lower weight level. I'm going to try HIMSS oral medicine or other things like that. So I don't think miraculously people are going to be able to access the branded GLPs in the post-shortage world. And I think the majority of people will just stop it completely or find alternative non-GLP medicines.
Yeah.
On that note, Dr. H, Elon Musk has said many times on Twitter, the greatest thing we can do to buoy American health is make GLP-1s lower cost across the board. And he's I don't know that Elon has tagged Trump in those tweets, but he's good friends with Trump now. Andrew Dudum has tagged both Trump and Elon Musk in a few of his tweets recently, talking about how HIMSS does have low-cost GLP-1s, among the lowest cost, actually, I think you can find anywhere. Let's move to the topic of Elon Musk and Trump. They have this bromance now, if we can call it that. How long do we predict that's going to last? Will it have any impact on the pricing of GLP-1s, and will it have any impact on HIMSS? Of course, Andrew Dudum is tweeting at both of them now. And so what are we to make of that?
I have some thoughts on the Elon-Trump relationship. I think if Elon truly wants to get his hands in the whole GLP-1 business and the court battles and stuff, he might actually have a chance of somehow framing Trump's mindset on this whole issue here. That's if he wants to. We've seen, I can get to Bayside's opinion on this, but we've seen how Elon's opinions on some political matters has resulted in some change of Trump's opinions on things. We saw with Elon's stance on H-1B visas for immigration. He was very pro H-1B, where historically Trump and his administration may not have been. But we've seen Trump kind of change his mindset a little bit and be more acceptance and being more okay with increasing H-1B visas applicants and stuff like that. So we've seen how in this world, what Elon says and his thoughts can somehow mold what Trump is thinking too. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think I said in our last podcast, I happen to be in the camp that I have considerable respect for what Elon has created. And I mean, I've not done that. Very few people have. He's the richest man in the world. The downside, though, is I do know politics. In my world, your job as somebody who's active in the political world is to get along with everybody. Yes, there's some times where you want to take pot shots and fight and try to win those kinds of battles. But generally speaking, if you actually want to get things done, you're not looking to alienate people. You're looking to make friends. And if two people or two organizations disagree with each other, you focus on the areas where they agree and try to put the areas where they disagree to the side. That's not been Elon's way of doing things. He's pretty out there with some of the things he says on his Twitter feed in ways that are not what I would consider to be politically smart. And that comes with inexperience. I've seen it over and over again, really smart people making dumb mistakes because they think they know everything and they don't. His advantages is he has Twitter, which is huge, and he has a lot of money, which is also huge.
He's very high profile.
And he is very high profile, but that's a double-edged sword to some extent. With respect to Ozempic, I think if I were him and I really wanted that to be something I wanted to push, the best way to do it is not to put that out there publicly in the way that he has. You just say it directly. And I know that the Greenland thing is on here, which is crazy, but you talk to the president behind the scenes and says, I think you could score a win here. There's a lot of people out there that are overweight. And at the same time, it might help you on the Greenland thing, which we'll come to in a second. And if you know anything about Donald Trump, this is ancient history. It's probably before any of you guys were born. Donald Trump had ghostwritten a book a long time ago in the 80s called The Art of the Deal, and leverage, saying outrageous things was in there because then you start that and then you get what you really want, which is less outrageous. And then just looking for leverage any way you can get it. Both of those things are like music to Donald Trump's ears. So it is not impossible that you could tie a few of these things together and actually see the president weigh in.
With that in mind, wouldn't it be more advantageous for Elon Musk to really be out there with his GOP stance then, instead of, as you mentioned, going more directly behind the scenes with him?
He could be. I mean, it's just, generally speaking, like to use the immigration issue you were talking about a moment ago, he ended up stirring up the MAGA base in a way that wasn't necessary. That's an issue that could have been dealt with quietly and without stirring up the opposition. So it's one of the reasons why you tend to do things behind the scenes if you can.
I want to talk about Greenland, and I want to talk about, of course, RFK and McCary and what we know about them and what we should expect. Let's do Greenland briefly. Of course, Trump wants the whole thing. Trump wants the whole thing, and by the way, it's owned by. Is it owned by Denmark?
Denmark.
Not. Yeah, Denmark. I'm not up on this story. The United States buying new territory, massive new territory, is not something that I expected, but here we are. Denmark, of course, is where Novo is. Denmark owns Greenland. Trump wants Greenland. Could this impact him?
It could. It's crazy, right? This is just like ludicrous, but yeah, I think it could. So he wants Greenland for a variety of economic and national security reasons. The Arctic is a big, important place for all sorts of reasons. I think it's got something like 50,000 people living there. It's a territory of Denmark, and he wants it. And he's willing to cut a deal with Denmark, but he's also willing to put pressure on him. All anyone has to say to him is, well, so how can we get leverage over Denmark? Well, one of the biggest companies in all of Europe is Novo Nordisk, and there are a lot of things that they want, including this compounding thing. Just let the compounding keep going and let them squawk. And next thing you know, Denmark is maybe willing to cut a deal. It's the kind of thing that Trump does. It sounds outrageous the whole thing. The United States is somehow going to take over Greenland. Are you serious? Well, I don't know if that's going to happen. They may end up cutting a deal where they get a base, more so of a military presence than they have currently, something like that. But this is the kind of stuff that Trump does, and he throws out these outrageous ideas, and then he'll get what he really wants. And in the meantime, HIMSS might benefit because the White House tells the FDA, let's hold off on that decision.
Bayside, you're so good about assigning odds. I kind of want to hold you to it here.
This one's too out there.
Is this on the order of like 5-10% that
it all depends who talks to Trump. If somebody actually mentions this idea, Like this is where, for instance, Andrew Dudum, they gave $1 million so that they can support the inauguration. And I think I saw that Andrew Dudum's, in theory, is going to be physically in a location where Trump himself may actually be there. If Andrew Dudum said something like this to Elon Musk or somebody like that, so it actually gets to the ear of the president, the chances of it goes up to very possible. I don't have no basis for assigning a percentage to it, so I don't want to say, but it's possible.
It's harder. Okay. Realm.
I do want to say, as crazy as it sounds, and it sounds way, way, way crazy to me, there's a not zero chance this could happen. If you think about historically of empires, we know about Roman empires, we know about British empires, French empires. There is the American empire. There's a book called How to Hide an Empire, The History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. And it talks about how America basically is all around the world, and we have an American empire. We think about territories, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, our presence in the Philippines, all these different places around the world with historical importance to the American nation and empire. I don't know. It's maybe not that crazy, but it is crazy, but maybe not too crazy. But I'm just throwing other ideas out there. Check out that book, How to Hide an Empire.
Excellent idea. I can only say for all our many European friends in the Discord, we love you.
There are a lot. We did a poll. I did a poll asking people where they're from, and beyond belief, it was 50-60% European, I think like 30% American, 10% Asian. So interest in hymns is worldwide, which is fascinating and totally unexpected.
I think that makes sense too, because the American healthcare system is so unique in its own right with its flaws and benefits and flaws. People are flocking to try to find information about how would hymns work in this setting of the American healthcare system. So I think that makes sense that there's so many people from around the world, joining us in the community.
Yeah, it does. I totally didn't expect it, but it's cool to see. And as Bayside says, we love you. We love you. Okay, moving to RFK and Marty Makary. RFK, of course, is nominated to be Secretary of HHS. Makary, the new head of FDA. What do we know about each? I know less about Makary. Of RFK, I listened to him a bit when he was running for president, at least among the medical establishment. I think the vast majority see him as pretty kooky. There are still others who see him at minimum as like throwing sunlight on a few things that at least should be considered differently. He certainly has some unorthodox ideas. I think even he would agree. Makary, I know a little less about, but is sort of skeptical of modern medicine. I think it's closely related to the title of one of his books. What do we think about each of them as leading healthcare for the next 4 years and any impact on HIMSS?
I've got some opinions, but I'll defer to Dr. H first if he wants to go first.
Yeah, I could just give a brief overview of Dr. Marty Makary. When the news broke out first with this nomination, I think a lot of people online were very excited because he has held or currently holds a chief medical officer or CMO position with one of the telehealth companies, Sesame, and they do some GLP compounding. So I think stock prices went up and people were quite excited. Oh, we have a pro compounder on the side, and things might be looking great for the future of compounding. So I did do a little bit more looking into him. He's very well decorated with his CV and resume. General surgeon by trade, went to Georgetown, did some fellowships, surgical oncology at Johns Hopkins. He's a faculty member at Johns Hopkins. He's done a lot of work outside of the actual practice of medicine too. So he has provided commentary on the state and nature of the healthcare system. He's had some pretty influential writings where he was talking about how to prevent surgical complications, and it helped kind of guide the procedural guidelines of how to work in an operating room to reduce complications. He's not afraid to provide his insight and critique in the healthcare system. So that's kind of led to some, he's written some books, as Jonathan has mentioned there. So one of his books was called Unaccountable, which was a New York Times bestselling book. And, he wanted to bring up the fact that many issues in the healthcare system can be addressed with common sense solutions His latest book is called Blind Spots, and it encourages people to think critically about how today's medical establishment develops a consensus, and to really look at cases where maybe the doctors in the establishment isn't quite fully right. Maybe there's areas for improvement. So just encouraging people to kind of like look at things with a critical light. He seems to be pretty politically and media savvy. He's done a lot of media appearances on Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News. He's done TED Talks. He's been on CNBC, C-SPAN. So, and even there's a medical podcast that's pretty popular called ZDogg MD. So he's out there. He knows how to navigate the waters. I think he tries to toe the line and present many aspects and perspectives of the healthcare system. So he comes across as a pretty independent thinker about how healthcare should be delivered. He's donated to both Democrat and Republican politicians in their campaigns. He's also previously criticized publicly the politicalness of the FDA, so that might play a role in how he might want to come across as the FDA commissioner in the future. I did want to bring up a point in a question to Bayside is, there was all this excitement about him being pro-compounder, pointing to the fact that he was with Sesame. I did want to mention that for a small telehealth company like Sesame, they were probably paying him no more than 150 to 200 grand for his role at max, probably. I would, if I were to guess. So it's not a small amount, but not crazy amount too. And I think at some point, Bayside mentioned, do you know when FDA commissioners, when their position is over, are they typically then going into the private world and working with pharma again? Are they doing other things more in the public sphere? What's been the previous MO of other FDA commissioners after their FDA appointment's done? And
I haven't looked into that closely enough. I did actually look into the conflict of interest rules a little bit to find out if McCary could even make any decisions that affect a prior employer. And apparently he can, unless there was an unduly large payout from the prior employment. So if you were have gotten some sort of equity stake, prior to exiting, that kind of thing, it could prevent him from making a decision on that. That said, I basically agree with everything you said, Dr. H. The one thing I'll say, and this is an area professionally where I've had some experience, I've done a lot of work in the evidence-based world, with some of it related to evidence-based medicine. The general critique of evidence-based medicine, including the work of the FDA, which is to some extent ties to the drug trials, but you can do evidence-based medicine in a lot of other ways as well, studies that are out there. The problem has been that while evidence-based medicine makes a lot of sense, it can be corrupted by incentives that are financial. And so the pharmaceutical companies have a strong incentive to have studies that show that their drugs work, that you've got efficacy, but that they are also safe. So minimal adverse side effects, things of that nature. Generally speaking, when they've done research on studies, that what they found, first of all, is a lot of studies are not reproducible. And that studies that were sponsored by pharmaceutical companies or those with a financial interest are unsurprisingly more likely to show results that are benefit the organization that's sponsoring it. And so as a result, a lot of people who are genuinely supportive of evidence-based medicine have recognized some of these adverse incentives in terms of the for-profit model, but also some of the institutional incentives that surround those in a position of power who are able to make decisions that run against those who are perceived to be challenging the established common wisdom. And McCary appears to be squarely in the camp of the skeptics, as is RFK for that matter. All of them claim to be supporting evidence-based medicine against some of these things that are running against what evidence medicine is trying to actually accomplish. So I think all of them will claim to be operating within the realm of supporting evidence-based medicine, but some are sort of on the institutional side and some are on the side of challenging the institutions. And I think both RFK and McCary are on the side of challenging the institutions.
I did want to bring up, I actually went and bought the Blind Spots book and leafed through to the section where McCary specifically mentions GLPs. So this might be interesting to our listeners here who are hoping that he'd be pro GLPs, pro compounding, things like that. He actually included his blurb And then Jonathan, maybe you can put the screenshots up on the podcast so they can see too. But in the book, he actually says about GLP-1s, he includes this in the section where he's encouraging people to kind of think critically of the medical establishment. So the title of this section says, GLP-1 drugs save lives. Highly celebrated GLP-1 medications like Ozempic appear to be effective not only for losing weight, but also reducing health problems. He talks about the benefits of that. And then immediately after that, talks about how, however, we quite don't know about the long-term ramifications of using, widespread GLP-1s. While it appears that we are seeing exciting health benefits from these medications, we have to be open to the fact that future research could tell us that people on these long-term ultimately may live longer or shorter lives. So he's basically saying this seems great, but let's wait and see. So right from his own words about GLP-1s, it sounds to me like he's open to it and likes the premise of the results that we're seeing, but maybe putting a little bit of cold water a little bit on the excitement a little bit about the long-term ramifications. And this kind of goes along with his perception that he's a skeptic that you mentioned, Bayside, right?
Yeah, and that particular criticism is very common. We heard the exact same thing about the COVID shots, for instance. You can't know the long-term consequences of any drug that is that new because by definition, you could not have done a study that covers the long-term effects. So it's unknown.
Yeah, he was pretty open about his criticism about some of the vaccine things related to COVID. He seemed to kind of toe a line about, being pro-vaccine for COVID, but also at the same time how it was rolled out with mandates and things like that too. So yeah, I can see that perception where he's kind of like on that skeptic side of it. So I don't know how that plays into the pro-compounding view. To me, it seems like maybe he's not necessarily going to be pro-compounding with some of these things. He might be more of a, wait and see kind of a thing.
I think so. I would agree with that.
Yeah, that was great, Dr. H. Thanks for coming to the table with all of that. I'll just say, in case it's interesting to the listeners, I think Hims rallied close to 20% the day that it was announced that McCary was being nominated. So clearly the markets were excited about that. And then there were a few notes that we had access to from Morgan Stanley, from Truist, and from Needham, all suggested that McCary may be favorable for compounders like Hims. The Truist note actually said, I'll read the quote, Hims is cautiously optimistic. So the company itself, when Truist was talking to Hims is cautiously optimistic that McCary's background bodes favorably for business models like that of Hims. So, clearly the street is excited about McCary. As Dr. H just said, it's like, maybe, but we're going to wait and see. And it's just so hard to know given what he said publicly. But thanks for coming.
The only last thing I'll say on that is there's a difference between being pro telehealth and pro compounder. They're not the same thing necessarily.
That is true too.
Great. Well, we've just hit an hour. At some point, would love to talk about this list that Medicare is going to release, drugs that they'd like to lower prices on. And as we alluded to a couple episodes ago, there's a PayPal mafia effect potentially in the works here with Abraham and Dudum and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel that we'd like to chat about at some point. And Lewis, we'll go to you for that in a future episode, but we're at an hour, so we're going to cut it here. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Hims House episode 18. If you're not in the Discord, join. The link is below. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to the Substack. Bayside, thank you again very much for being here. This was terrific. And we will see all of you next time. Thank you very much.
Right.